Shalom. I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to be sharing with you regarding the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and it is as follows.
Recently, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry made his 10th trip to the Middle East in an effort to try to achieve a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. Following meetings with Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, Kerry said, "The two sides are not there yet, but we are making progress and we're beginning to have dialogue on the toughest hurdles yet to be overcome. This is hard work. There have been many years of mistrust that have been built up, all of which have to be worked through and undone, and a pathway has to be laid down on which the parties can have confidence that they know what is happening and the road ahead is real and not illusionary. However, the path is becoming clearer. The puzzle is becoming more defined and is becoming more and more apparent to everyone what the remaining tough issues are," he said. Kerry said that all the major issues in the conflict, that is borders, security, the fate of Palestinian refugees, and the status of Jerusalem, were under discussion, and that any U.S. Middle East peace plan would be fair and balanced. A U.S. official said that one of the main obstacles holding up the framework deal is each side's demand that their reservations over the framework appear as a separate appendix in the final text, rather than as part of the main text which details the area of common ground in the talks. It is essential that if there are reservations, they will be part of the framework, not a separate part. Otherwise, it would damage the agreement. For example, if the framework includes a clause stating that the negotiations will be based on the 1967 borders, we cannot agree to a reservation stating that one of the sides opposed this, the official said. Any agreed framework would not be a signed document, but would address all the core issues including the borders between Israel and a future Palestine, security, Palestinian refugees, and conflicting claims to Jerusalem, the official said. The official also said that if the parties agreed on a framework for negotiating a final peace deal, it might not be made public to avoid exposing the leaders to political pressures at home. The U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, said that a U.S. framework proposal will be presented to both sides soon and within the next several weeks. Israel Knesset member Amir Peretz said that the two sides were attempting not to get a framework agreement, but rather to a framework for future negotiations. He explained that a framework agreement would be a document that both sides would have to sign, something that does not seem possible at present. Instead, he said that Kerry would present a framework that would form the basis for future negotiations into which each side could append its reservations. This type of framework would enable the negotiations to continue past their late April deadline. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told members of his Likud political party that there is no American framework document yet, and that even if it could be agreed, it would not be binding on both sides. Netanyahu said that there would be elements in the non-binding paper that he and his party colleagues wouldn't like, and elements that the Palestinians wouldn't like. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is working on a document spelling out America's basic principles for a peace agreement that both sides, with reservations, are to agree to follow as a framework for continuing Israel-Palestinian negotiations. Israel officials said that if this particular track toward extending the negotiations beyond the late April deadline bears fruit, then both Israel and the Palestinians are expected to say that the positions reflected in the document are American positions, not necessarily the ones that they accept, but they would continue to negotiate based upon the American document. Among the issues expected to be difficult for Israel to swallow is a declaration that the endgame is a Palestinian state based on 1967 borders with minor land swaps. And among the bitter pills for the Palestinians is expected to be a formula recognizing Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people and making clear that the Palestinian refugees are to be absorbed in the future Palestinian state. He also assured the Likud Knesset members that he had not given in to American pressure for more flexible positions regarding the fate of Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley, and said he was only too aware of the consequences of dismantling West Bank settlements in the absence of a viable peace accord. Furthermore, Netanyahu said that the root of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the Palestinian Authority's encouragement of incitement against Israel and the Palestinian refusal to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. This incitement, unfortunately, continues, Netanyahu said, adding that we have seen aspects of this recently. We are not foreigners in Jerusalem. We are not foreigners in Beit El. We are not foreigners in Hebron. I repeat that this is the root of the conflict, as well as the root of incitement that does not recognize this basic fact, and that is to have a Jewish state. Israel Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon said, I want to clarify that we are now engaged in an attempt to reach the framework of the continued negotiations for a period beyond 9 months. We are not engaged in negotiating a framework for a permanent status agreement, but the framework for future negotiations, Ya'alon continued. It is clear to us that there are large gaps between us and the Palestinians, and this is not new, but is certainly in our interest to continue negotiations and to continue to work to stabilize the situation and the relationship between us and the Palestinians. We stand to defend the security interests of Israel, and I have made my opinion heard several times. The heart of the conflict is the Palestinians' refusal to recognize Israel as a sovereign state, and regarding security issues relevant for the state of Israel, I will be a tough nut to crack. In addition, Ya'alon said that peace cannot be achieved until the Palestinian stops its incitement against Israel and starts educating for peace instead. A basic element in Israeli education is the aspiration for peace. In the Palestinian Authority, that doesn't exist. The first stage of the roadmap that obligates the Palestinians to stop the incitement and to educate for peace did not happen. Former Israel Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin demanded in the 1993 Oslo Accords that the Palestinian charter that called for the destruction of Israel to be changed, and it hasn't happened yet to this very day, Ya'alon said. The Palestinians receive from states that donate to educational institutes within the Palestinian Authority that teach incitement and racism based upon quotes by Adolf Hitler. They claim that there is no Jewish people, he added. According to other senior Israeli officials, there is no guarantee that either side would agree to a deal lengthening the talks. The Palestinians have stated that they would prefer to give an oral agreement to continue talks rather than sign a written document, to evade responsibility perhaps in the event that the peace talks fail. If Israel accepts the U.S. framework proposal, Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is planning to have a national referendum on the issue. Netanyahu was also quoted as saying that he needs the referendum to push back domestic pressures from the right, but in any case he believes it will be politically advantageous. He has confided to his closest circle that for the first time he is in favor of Kerry's proposals, and although they don't see eye to eye on many of the issues, he thinks the gaps between them can be bridged. Netanyahu is counting on the framework accord gaining an overwhelming popular majority in a referendum. Netanyahu regards the Obama administration's acceptance of Israel as the Jewish national state to be a historic achievement of unparalleled importance. He was encouraged to learn that Kerry is working on a formula that avoids citing East Jerusalem as the capital of a future Palestinian state only as a goal for their national aspirations. Intense exchanges are going back and forth on the security arrangements for the Jordan Valley, which runs along Israel's eastern border, and the number and area of Jewish settlements remaining under Israeli sovereignty. A number of settlements outside the main blocks are due for removal, despite reports to the contrary, but the argument among the Americans, Israelis, and Palestinians is over a timetable for their staged evacuation, which is counted in years. In order to pressure Israel into accepting a U.S. framework agreement, Israel government sources are saying that U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is behind calling for a European boycott against Israeli products and companies operating in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The European Union published its guidelines last July, boycotting Israeli companies operating over the 1949 armistice lines. At the moment, Kerry is making sure the threats stay in check, but as soon as peace talks fail, he intends to open the floodgates and spur on a full-blown international boycott on Israel, according to Israel Radio. Meanwhile, Kerry has threatened to discontinue all U.S. aid to the Palestinian Authority if the current round of negotiations does not result in a peace agreement, according to a senior Palestinian official. Taser Khaled, a member of the PLO Executive Committee, said that the United States had implied it would stop giving financial aid to the Palestinian Authority and would not be able to prevent Israel's expansion of West Bank settlements if a framework for a long-lasting accord was not agreed upon. So far, the negotiations have not led to a significant breakthrough on the core issues, Khaled said. The Palestinian side cannot sign a framework agreement because it does not comply with our minimum requirements and with rights of the Palestinians. We will not give up on the Palestinian cause just for money. Another Palestinian official said that Kerry and the Palestinian leadership talked about everything but without agreeing on anything. The Palestinians say that they have presented their positions on all the issues to Kerry. Palestinian spokesman Yasser Abed Rabo said that Kerry's conversations with the boss were very tough indeed, in particular when it came to the United States' wish for the Palestinians to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. The Americans have made it very clear that recognition of Israel as a Jewish state is their position. They talk about it in meetings with our side and make an issue out of it. We have made it very clear that we're not going to sign any agreement that recognizes Israel as a Jewish state. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that the Palestinians' refusal to formally acknowledge Israel as a Jewish state has become the key topic in his discussions with Kerry. After meeting with Netanyahu and Abbas, Kerry went to Saudi Arabia to try to convince Saudi Arabia to change the language in the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative to include recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, should the country reach a peace deal with the Palestinians. The changed language would also include the stipulation that Israel's Arab citizens not be affected by recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. The current language in the Arab Peace Initiative calls for the Arab world to offer comprehensive peace with Israel in exchange for a full pullout from all territories it captured in the 1967 war. The Palestinians have not given permission for any changes to the Arab League initiative. Kerry is expected to meet in Paris soon with Arab League foreign ministers who sit on the monitoring committee of the Arab Peace Initiative and may present the idea to them. After that meeting, he is expected to return to the Middle East for another round of shuttle diplomacy between Israel and the Palestinians. If Benjamin Netanyahu decides to support the U.S. framework agreement and it calls for a Palestinian state based upon 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, then the Jewish Home political party said that it will not be part of Netanyahu's government that negotiates the 67 borders. Jewish Home leader Naftali Bennett said, "No more word games. The 1967 lines means dividing Jerusalem and giving up the Western Wall, the Temple Mount, and the Old City. In what way will our history remember a leader that agrees to give up Jerusalem? We will not sit in such a government." In addition, the Sephardic Orthodox Jewish Party Shas and its leader Ari Deri said that his party would not give Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government a safety net, refusing to form a new coalition to enable a peace deal loaded with Israeli withdrawals, and stressed that he would oppose any agreement that harms the Jewish communities in the West Bank. Derry said that it was his impression that the talks are seriously advancing toward a framework agreement. Finally, a new academic research institute will be founded to explore the issue of declaring Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank. The decision to found the institute comes as an outgrowth of previous large conferences calling for sovereignty in the West Bank, as well as the journal called Sovereignty. Well, this is going to conclude this week's report, where we shared with you regarding the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process.
Until we do it again, Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.